So, former prosecutor, disabled Army vet. She was a Russian linguist in the U.S. Army. I was her instructor as a U.S. Navy Russian language instructor. She was prosecuting for about 10 years there in Florida. Went to work for a constitutional law firm defending First Amendment rights, religious liberty in particular. And then came back to the state attorney's office, and the office had been won by a raving leftist Looney Tune. And our local community found out that she was defending constitutional rights, and the school board asked her to come speak. Some local groups, Tea Parties, Republican parties, different groups, asked her to come teach. And she was teaching on her own time, on her own dime, not representing herself as representative of the state attorney's office. Nevertheless, he sends an email one morning saying, you need to cease and desist your association with right-wing fringe groups. Long story short, he said, do this or be fired. She said, you didn't give me my liberty, and I'm not going to surrender to you for a paycheck. So she was fired. And we've been doing this for 7 years ever since. Can I tell you one more? I know you guys, I don't want to waste a lot of your time, but it's probably like this. We had just planted a church, and a little church we were trying to build up. I was taking no salary as the pastor. She was the only income at that time in the house when we prayed and decided that, yeah, you've told our people that everybody, they ought to stand for their liberty. Yeah, we ought to do that too. She was fired. We went down to earning 0 overnight. People in our town had a big protest. They got the pitchforks and torches and surrounded the state attorney's office and yelled and screamed. For 3 days, the guy said, I couldn't get anything done. We got no work done. He went nuts, but that ruckus got the attention, apparently, of Neil Cavuto. So she is on Neil Cavuto for, I don't know, a minute and a half. And suddenly we start getting letters and little donations, people saying thank you, and we appreciate what you're doing. Here's $5, here's $10. And we get this letter from a mom with a check, and she says, we saw what you're doing. We saw the interview on the Jacksonville news station, and man, we just really are excited about that. We took our kids, we used this as a teaching opportunity. They were excited about it, so our kids decided that they wanted to gather up their allowance and send it to you. So we together as a family, we just went around and we collected all of the loose change and everything we could find in the house. And she said, so we've enclosed a check for what we've collected. And it was this off-the-wall amount of something like $137.52 or whatever. And we laughed like some of you did then, and we thought, round it down, round it up. Who's going to know? It doesn't matter to us. Why would you write such a wacky amount? Okay, that's what they collected. Or we cashed the check. We praise the Lord. Thank goodness. Then a week later, we figured out the amount. We got the electric bill for exactly $137.52 or whatever it was. That has happened, and she doesn't charge speaking fees for where we go, whether it's a group of 8 or a group of 8,000. We decided from that day forward, this is what God wants us to do. You don't charge people for it. He enabled her to write the books and do the DVDs, and we just sell books and things to help people, and then people can donate. But that thing, like that, has happened over and over and over again for 7 solid years. So, amen, out of the message that Shalise was sharing, I am convinced, and we are convinced by experience, that if you stand for the gifts of God, He will stand with you. You may not understand how whatever plays out in that present circumstance, but you can be guaranteed, if you're standing for His gifts, He's in it, He has a purpose for it, and He will take you where you need to be, and He will make a way. Ladies and gentlemen, KrisAnne.
Well, Shalise was right. The Constitution is not complicated. You don't need to be a scholar. As a matter of fact, we have all the tools we need right here in our hands with our cell phones. Everything that you need to know to research and understand the Constitution is right there in your hand. are superior to the people who gave us our constitutional republic. It's the whole living, breathing lie, right? We're technologically advanced, so we must be intellectually superior. So we need to go back and tell the founders what they meant when they wrote the Constitution, because they were too stupid to know for themselves. But see, this is the crazy thing. If we really believe that, then we must accept that we're being deceived. Because you see, when the men who wrote our Constitution wrote that Constitution in 1787, they wrote that document so that every single common man on the street could pick up that document, not just simply read it, but understand it and know exactly how their government was supposed to work. If they, the common man on the street in 1787, could pick up the Constitution, read it, understand it, and know how their government is supposed to work, and if we are intellectually superior today than they were back then our Constitution ought to be a no-brainer for everybody in this room. You don't need to be a Supreme Court justice. You don't need to be a politician. You don't need to have a law degree to understand the Constitution. Can I just step up and tell you, as a person with a law degree, having a law degree will interfere with understanding the Constitution. Because we don't teach the Constitution in law schools anymore. We teach constitutional law, which teaches that our judges and our lawyers know more about the Constitution than the men who wrote it. Then we spend all of our legal career, from education to retirement, devising ways to circumvent the Constitution so we can win our arguments. We put down the teachings of those who wrote the Constitution and picked up the teachings of those who loved government. And then they started teaching us that we were too stupid to know. It was beyond our reach. Don't worry about that, we'll take care of it for you. You know, just vote. Put us there, we'll do it for you. And then somehow we got into this idea that if we elect Joe the plumber to become a federal representative, when he lived next door to us, he knew plumbing. But all of a sudden, when we put him in office in Washington, D.C., some great white dove departed from heaven, landed upon his head, and gave him every information and knowledge he needed to know about the Constitution and how to run government. But we were too stupid to know ourselves. We've devolved into an arbitrary government because we've put down principles and picked up phantoms. We no longer have policies built on constitutional principles, on historical principles. We create laws based on the need for security and prosperity, two things that can never be achieved. You can never be safe. You will never feel safe. I mean, in 2001, when the towers fell, everybody got scared, and we ran to the government and said, "Oh, please, keep us safe." The magic words, government's always been scared. We'll let you do whatever you need to do to keep us safe. How many of you feel safer today? I maybe recognize you have a whole lot less liberty than too. Because you see, when you trade liberty for temporary security, you will have neither. Prosperity is another phantom. I remember as a young person reading an article in Time magazine, an interview with John Rockefeller. And the journalist asked him, "Mr. Rockefeller, you've amassed all this wealth. You've done the right things for a very long time. You've become a very, very wealthy man. Can you please give our readers some insights and let us know, when is enough money responded and said, I don't know, I'll tell you when I get there. Because prosperity is a phantom. What I'm going to teach you tonight may sound like a history lesson. I mean, it's a British history lesson. But it's much more than that. Because you see, our Constitution was not written in 1787. There is absolutely nothing new, nothing novel, nothing invented by our founders in our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution, or our Bill of Rights. Every single thing within those 3 documents comes from 5 documents that were written over 700 years. This is not just a history lesson, this is a relevance lesson. This is the education that we ought to have been teaching in our schools over and over and over again for the last 150 years. So we as a people can know that the Constitution and its principles are just as relevant and applicable today as they were in 1787. Because there is nothing new under the sun. Human nature never changes. Government always operates the same way. And for some reason, we always end up doing the same stupid stuff over and over again. Patrick Henry said, I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that is the lamp of experience. I know no way to judge the future but by the past. Because those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat its mistakes. You see, the simplest things of history we miss. Oh, what happened to my slide? I think my husband's been doing some editing for me. Think it's a figure eight does, find out. That's okay. You see, the simplest things we fail to teach make the building blocks for who we are. When I teach the young people, I ask them, who fought in the Revolutionary War? And quite often they'll tell me, the Americans and the British. Only there were no Americans in our Revolutionary War. There were British people fighting their own government. See, it was a civil war. And it wasn't really a revolution on our part. The American colonists were not revolting against anything. It was their government that had revolted against their constitutional charters, refusing the American colonists their God-given and legally established rights. It was the government that was revolting. The American colonists were in a battle to restore proper governance. So it was actually a war of restoration. George Washington was the subject of a king. James Madison was the subject of a king. Thomas Jefferson, subject of a king. And that is the only style of government they had ever known for over 700 years. So you gotta ask yourself, why in the world did they choose a republic instead of a kingdom? It's all they knew. Why didn't they just tally up the history from 700 years and the experience from 700 years and say, hey, we've got all this under our belt. We can make what we've got better. We can do a kingdom of America and make it better than the kingdom that we've had before. Does that sound ridiculous? I don't know why it would sound ridiculous. The communists have been trying to do it for centuries. We'll take communism and make it better than the last generation. And it always fails. Because you see, the focus in a kingdom, in communism, in a democracy, is Washington to be king. How many remember that from your history lessons? We're going to take all this experience and we're going to do something different because, you see, we have a different focus. We have one focus. That focus is liberty. We declared it in the Declaration of Independence. We established it in the preamble of the Constitution to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. The Bill of Rights is further affirmation of the people's liberty. That was the thing they were focused on. And they knew from all their study of human nature, from all their personal experience in government and their historical experience with government, that only a republic can secure liberty. Only a government where laws are created through equal representation. Kingdoms don't do that. The only thing that a kingdom preserves is they'll always be kings and always be subjects. We are not a democracy. We know that, right? We are not a democracy. Because the only thing a democracy secures is that there will always be masters and always be slaves. Because a democracy is nothing more than mob rule. So if you're not in the majority group with the majority rule, you are a slave. They said we have to do this republic. But you see, we miss the details in between. We forget to teach all the history. And then we end up sort of deifying them. Thinking that they're somehow different from us. It's sort of ironic, isn't it? We teach that they were too stupid to know how to deal with internet and automatic rifles, but we think that they were geniuses to create the Constitution. I'm not taking away from their wisdom and their knowledge, and I do believe, after studying them the way that I have, that a good number of them were genius level. But they were people, like you and me, with passions, with children, with families, with experience, with property, with jobs, with problems. They were not anything more or less than we are today. And because we failed to teach the history that taught them who we needed to be, we don't know who we are. And we end up chasing phantoms instead of defending principles. So join with me as we go back in history and we learn the experience that drove our founders to say that liberty was more important than everything, including your life. For our founders, that history would begin in 1014, the practical experience that we're talking about. In 1014, there is no England yet. There is no United Kingdom. There is no Great Britain. There is only a land where the Anglo-Saxon people live. That's where we get this term England, by the way. It's a blending of the words Anglo-land. Anglo-land, England, the land where the Anglo-Saxons live. Now, at this time in 1014, the Anglo-Saxons have no king. They had been previously, most recently, ruled by a Danish king in the Danish kingdom, but the Danish king died and then they resisted the Danish rule. They remained governing themselves in small communities. You see, by 1014, they had figured out that foreign rule, foreign law, and foreign principles were always destructive to their liberty. So they resisted foreign kingdoms over them. But you see, when you live in a community in 1014, there are certain problems that you have that we don't have today. For example, if you live in a community in 1014, the neighboring community is probably a good day's ride away. You're not hopping over there on the freeway. And if your sentinel in the tower, standing guard of your community, happens to look off and see a foreign kingdom coming to attack you, you're not picking up your cell phone and texting the neighbor and saying, hey, come on over, it's time to gather the troops and defend ourselves. So in 1014, the Anglo-Saxons were having a very difficult time defending themselves and organizing, listen to these words, organizing for their common defense. Does that sound familiar? The preamble to our Constitution. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, preserve the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, we do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America, for the common defense. Not only that, if you want to keep peace with a neighboring kingdom, the best way to do that is through treaties. Through a treaty of commerce, so they have a vested interest in you, or a peace treaty. But if you don't have a king, how are you going to negotiate that treaty? How many of you think that a king is going to negotiate with some common person? It's not going to happen. So they decided that they really needed to go ahead and organize their government. They needed to have a king. They didn't know any better. That's all they knew. Now, understanding the nature of kings is understanding certain principles. First and foremost, kings are not chosen. Kings are not elected. Kings are born. It's a principle called divine right. Divine right says God makes kings. And the only way you get to be king is if you're born in the right family and in the right birth order. So even if you're the fourth born of 4 sons, you don't get to be king unless you can kill off 3 brothers, right? I mean, you know that happens. A lot. It's going to happen in our history, actually. So recognizing and acknowledging this divine right principle, the Anglo-Saxons go to this man, his name is Ethelred, and they say to Ethelred, we'll make a deal with you. Did you see Ethelred's Anglo-Saxon? And Ethelred's family had been kings back when they had Anglo-Saxon kings. And we'll make a deal with you, Ethelred. We will allow you to be our king on one condition. Your only job is to help us organize for our common defense and to help us create treaties with foreign kingdoms. You will leave us alone to govern ourselves. Now, if we've been teaching this history for the last 150 years, everybody in the room would be connecting dots right now. Be like, oh, okay, I see that. Because the Ethelred Agreement is the exact same agreement that the states made when they created the federal government through the Constitution. How many of you heard of a guy named James Madison? Who can tell me what James Madison's nickname is? Father of the Constitution. The father of our Constitution wrote a document that we call Federalist 45. He says the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. Those that remain in the states are numerous and indefinite. He says the powers delegated to the federal government through the Constitution will be exercised principally on external objects. That's how our founders talked about foreign affairs. And then he named them. War, peace, negotiation, foreign commerce. He said every other power, all is the word that he actually used, all other powers, to include the lives, the liberties, the properties of the people, the internal order, improvement, and prosperity of the state are reserved to the states. The basic foundational principle of who we are as a constitutional republic was not an invention. It was an inheritance from the Ethelred Agreement of 1014. Human nature always kicks in, though. Or maybe you know a guy named Solomon. I'm hoping you don't really know him, right? Nobody here that old, right? Solomon said, there is nothing new under the sun. you start calling somebody a king, don't be surprised when he starts acting like one. And when people start looking toward their government to be their protector and their provider, don't be shocked when the people start acting like subjects. So our history now is 30 years later. We have a king named Edward the Confessor, and the people love Edward. They love Edward. They describe him in their history as being a generous king. Now, under the Ethelred Agreement, does the king have the authority to be generous? He's got no authority in domestic affairs at all. But here's the thing. When the king starts handing out free stuff, the people don't ask where it came from or what they gotta do to keep it. Because human nature says people like free stuff. Now the problem here is that Edward is about to die and he has no son to become king after him. And the Anglo-Saxons are very concerned for several reasons. First and foremost, they want to make sure that they have another king that is generous like Edward. The other thing that concerns them is next in line to be king is Edward's cousin. His name is William I. And the thing that concerns them about William is that William is not Anglo-Saxon. Remember, they learned in 1014, foreign government, foreign rule is the end of their rights and their liberties. So they don't want William to be their king. So they hatch out a plan to appoint this guy. His name is Harold Godwinson. Harold Godwinson was Edward's right-hand man, the second most powerful man in all of England. We're now in England. And they're pretty certain that Harold's going to rule in the same manner as Edward. But we have a problem, don't we? Because kings come by divine right. You don't pick kings. And Harold has no divine right to be king, and William does. Now William finds out they're trying to pass him over his God-given right, and that makes him very angry, which is really bad news for the Anglo-Saxons. Because you see, William has a nickname. He's called William the Conqueror. What do you suppose happens when you make a guy mad whose nickname is the Conqueror? What's he going to do? Well, William raises up his Norman army. He goes over and defeats Harold and the English people in a very famous battle you probably heard of in school called the Battle of Hastings. You probably learned the Battle of Hastings in school, but I probably bet you didn't learn that it was actually relevant to our Constitution. Well, now William is king, and his divine right to be king has been reaffirmed in his mind by his victory in the Battle of Hastings, right? Because if God didn't want him to be king, then he'd allowed him to lose. So now he's really bold. He's empowered. Not that he's a divine right, but it's God-proven. Now, William is not Anglo-Saxon. He is from Normandy. The Anglo-Saxon kingdom runs in a unique form of kingdom called a limited monarchy, because the king is limited in his power by the consent of the people. William is from your stereotypical kingdom, you know, like the ones you see in the movies. I say, you do, or else. And that's one of the reasons why they didn't want him. Now, by divine right, William and all kings have an authority to write law from the throne. It's called the power of decree. Now, William, being Norman, and wanting to rule in the unlimited Norman fashion, could very legally step up and say, I am king. And because God chose me to be king, a Norman, God must have chosen that you should all now be ruled by Norman law. So here's what we're going to do. From this day forward, by decree, this English land will now be ruled by Norman law. He legally has the right to do that. But William also understands a complexity with kingdoms. You see, when you don't like your king, do you start a recall petition? If you don't like your king, do you start searching for another king to run against him in the next election? No. When you don't like your king in a kingdom, what are your only options? Right, you're going to raise up an army, you've got to rebel, you've got to chop off his head. Well, William knows that he's just had to conquer these people to become king. So he is not a loved king, and he is pretty sure that right now there are people planning his rebellion. So he knows that if he steps up and with a stroke of a quill changes the law of the land, he is guaranteed to lose his head. So he decides not to do it that way. He decides that it would be better to simply fundamentally transform the kingdom in such a way that he gets all his foreign law that he wants, but the people don't realize that it's happening. Now, if you want to change the law without rewriting the law, how do you do that? Well, it's very simple, really. And William knew in 1066 exactly how to do it. The first thing you have to do is change out the judges in the legal system with judges who are not loyal to the law of the land, but loyal to the ideologies of the king. Because for some reason, it's somehow ingrained in our brains that judges are impartial. And we take this idea of impartial judge and we extend it to the judge being somehow immune from the virtues and vices that afflict everybody else on the planet. A judge is not prone to greed or political influence or hunger for power. You can trust your judges. And so you don't question them. It's what we do today. In America, we've established a system of judicial supremacy that has elevated our judiciary, especially on the federal level, to that of being oligarchs instead of subjects and servants of the people. So William changes out the judges and replaces them with judges that are going to do his bidding. He uses these judges to bring in the Norman law and enforce the Norman law on the people of the kingdom, even when it's contrary to their own. He uses those courts and the force of government now to chase the landowners off of their land. You see, anybody that disagrees with how William wants to run the government, they've got to go. So we're not going to actually pick up a sword and take the troops in to run them off the land. We can do it legally. And an interesting thing happens in Norman law. When land is abandoned, the ownership of that land restores back to the king. So when William is chasing all of his opposition out of the kingdom, he's getting a double benefit. Because not only is he getting rid of the people who don't like him, he now owns all their land. And he starts inviting all of his foreign friends to come live in the kingdom on his newly acquired land. How else do you quell a rebellion? You fill the kingdom full of people who like the foreign laws better than the law of the land. You get rid of all the opposition. Now the churches are very powerful in this era as well. And William's not going to let that power slip through his fingers either. And he starts trading out the leadership in the churches like he did the judges with leaders in the churches who are not loyal to the word of God, but loyal to the ideologies of the king. So now he can take this principle of divine right one step further, and the churches will now teach their people to disobey the king is to disobey God. So guess what? You have to submit to whatever the king says, even if against the word of God, because he is now the word of God. place over a period of 40 years through the reign of William I and his son, William II. William II is going to be described in history as being a wicked, evil king just like his father. But you'll notice by his dates of his rule that he's only going to rule for about 13 years. Because one day, William II and his little brother Henry I go hunting together. You know where this is headed, right? And William II is killed in a mysterious hunting accident. When a stray arrow from Henry's hunting party accidentally hits William, coincidentally making Henry king. Anybody here think this was an accident? Coincidence. Well, guess what? The English people were not buying that story either. Now, Henry is king, and it is true they did not like his brother William. But they also have a conflict here. They know that if Henry will kill his own brother to become king, then what will be the value of the lives of the people to him? Now, Henry realizes that he has a popularity problem. So he has to do some things to appease the people so he can keep his throne and his head at the same time. One of the first things Henry does is he comes to the people and he says, "People of my kingdom, whom I love so dear, I want you to know that I realize the circumstances surrounding the death of my brother, they may seem a bit suspicious. So I want to because I love you so much, I want to put your mind at ease. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to scour the entire kingdom, and I am going to identify the 3 wisest men in all of our land. And as I choose these 3 wise men, I will bring them here, deem them to be the great tribunal who will now determine whether I'm at fault for the death of my brother or not." I see some of your faces. You see there's a problem with that. This tribunal is the government investigating itself. Do you know the Anglo-Saxons were buying this whole thing? I have to wonder, however, if maybe Henry had a little bit of modern wisdom and insight, and instead of calling it a grand tribunal, he called it a congressional hearing. Do you think the people would have bought the verdict then? Well, the American people seem to. But isn't a congressional hearing the government investigating itself? So what do you suppose the verdict was on Henry from the tribunal? Innocent. Absolutely. He didn't gain any friends or win any favor with that one, so he kept trying. The most important thing that Henry will do in this history, the most important thing, he's going to sign the first of those 5 documents that I told you about. It is called the 1100 Charter of Liberties. This is a written promise from Henry the King that government will never be evil and oppressive again. How's that one working out for us? He makes a list of 14 things that government can never do, because if government does them, then the people will know they have an evil and oppressive government, and they will be righteously justified to resist such a government. Now, we're not going to go over all 14 today, but I do want to share one of them with you. Henry says, "If any baron or earl of mine shall die, his heirs shall not be forced to purchase their inheritance, but shall retrieve it through force of law and custom." Remember, we had trouble with the Williams stealing land from the people. One of the ways they were stealing the land was charging outrageous fees to claim the land by inheritance. And Henry said that was the mark of an evil and oppressive government. Hello? Is that ringing any bells out there? How many of you heard of inheritance tax? Death tax? Isn't that exactly what we're talking about here? I mean, seriously, don't pay your inheritance tax and see how much you get. Then maybe we might start figuring out in America that property ownership here is merely an illusion. Yeah. Nobody in America owns their property. You can pay off your mortgage and you still don't own your property. Test it out. Don't pay your property taxes for 3 years and see what happens. Because I tell you what, your negligent 3 years in property taxes is not going to equate to the value of your property. But the government's going to take it from you anyway. You see, they're not buying your land. They're repossessing it because they believe they own it and you have failed to pay your government rent. That's what property tax is. And in 1100, a king with no internet said that was the mark of an evil and oppressive government. How is it that the American people, so wise as we are, allow our government to call it revenue? Well, Henry is not interested in liberty. He has signed and sealed this to keep his head. But the good thing is this promise is binding on every single king in the future. And they're going to need this promise because in 100 years, they're going to have the most evil and oppressive king they'll ever know. Here he is. His name is John. John is a massive taxation king. And if you cannot afford to pay your taxes in John's kingdom, which is highly likely, you're going to be arrested, thrown into prison, mutilated. John is cutting off hands, feet, ears, cutting the tongues out of people who cannot afford to pay their taxes. He's even executing them. A bishop in John's day said he was evil and vicious, and that even hell will be found by the presence of John. Keeping that description in mind, did you know John was the first king to impose income tax on the English people? You guys know John, by the way. You probably don't realize it. How many of you know this guy? That's the king in the Robin Hood stories. How many of you believe, even just a little bit, that we're not teaching history accurately anymore? Well, then you won't be surprised to know that we're not teaching our legends accurately either. We've been raising our children for generations to believe that we should endear Robin Hood because he robbed from the rich to give to the poor. How many of you have heard that? But it's not true. Robin Hood was not robbing from the rich to give to the poor in an effort to redistribute wealth. Robin Hood was taking from the king and the crown the money that had been stolen from the people through oppressive and unlawful taxation and returning it to the people so they could live. Remember, John is going to execute you if you cannot pay your taxes. Robin Hood is not a socialist trying to put people on equal financial footing. Robin Hood is a liberty fighter. Because the first step to liberty is always a right to life. Because if you gotta pay the government for permission to live, you are in the worst form of slavery, and you're a dead man. Well, interesting bit of history that we learn here through John's reign that is proven throughout all of history. Murdering people for not paying their taxes is not enough to bring the people to point of rebellion. Because you see, although the people remain throughout history ignorant of history, government's always learning. And governments have figured out, and those in government have figured out, that if you can keep the people distracted by stuff, the stuff that they have, the stuff that they see, the stuff they think they can get, you know, that stuff that makes them happy and comfortable. All you have to do is trickle down just enough stuff to make them happy, comfortable subjects. always proves that governments then get power drunk over time. And they start thinking they can do anything and the people will never push back. And then at some period of time, it's always different in different periods of history, those in government commit some kind of fundamental error, and the people push back. John's fundamental error is this. The people have chosen a man by the name of Stephen Langton to be the head of their church. John steps up and says, I don't like this guy. He's not going to do what I tell him to do. So from this day forward, I, as king, will choose the leadership of your church. But here's the problem. The 1100 Charter of Liberties already addressed that 100 years ago. The very first promise Henry made, it wasn't even in the list of 14, it's in the preamble, declared that the church would be completely free from government intrusion. This, by the way, is where we get our principle, embodied in the First Amendment, of separation of church and state. I know you have heard people say separation of church and state is not in the Constitution. It is. It is embodied in the First Amendment. Our freedom of religion is essentially linked to separation of church and state. The problem is not separation of church and state. The problem is we don't know what that means. For centuries, separation of church and state has always meant that the government has no business in your church. It's only been since our most recent bout of educated ignorance that we have come to accept that separation of church and state means that God has no business in public discussion. And we didn't invent it. We inherited the principle that the only way your church is free is if there's no government in it at all. A rebellion comes against John, and we get the second document in the history of our Constitution. It's called the Magna Carta. How many of you heard of the Magna Carta? You see, if we teach the Magna Carta, we rarely teach its relevance to the Constitution. It's some British document. But if we teach the Constitution to the Magna Carta, rarely, if ever, do we go all the way back to the 1100 Charter of Liberties. I mean, think about this. How many of you remember learning about the 1100 Charter of Liberties in school? And when we miss that, we miss an important lesson in history about liberty and the price that has to be paid. So here's a little pop quiz. Everybody knows the answer to this question because I just taught it to you. Who wrote the 1100 Charter of Liberties? Henry I. The Magna Carta was not written by John. The Magna Carta was written by the people. The Magna Carta is the people standing up to John and saying, hey, you made us a promise in 1100 that government would never be evil and oppressive again. You obviously don't know how to keep your promises. So now we, the people, will rise. In our majesty, we're going to place ourselves above the king. And we are now going to tell the king what he can and cannot do, so he will keep his promises. The Magna Carta creates a committee of 25 men called the Royal Council. No taxation without legislation. As a matter of fact, the Royal Council has the authority to sit in the king's court and look the king dead in the eye and say, no, you can't do that because it breaks your promise. The people, through representation, governing the king. In our Bill of Rights, our 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th amendments all come from clauses 38 through 40 in the Magna Carta. We did not invent them. We inherited them. Clause 61 of the Magna Carta is a very, very important part of our Constitution. As a matter of fact, Clause 61 of the Magna Carta is is where our sheriff stopped being an agent of the government and started being a defender of the people. Not only that, we have a very important part of our First Amendment. Comes from Clause 61 of the Magna Carta. Now, Shalise already gave you a heads up to my pop quiz right here. But I want you to think about that. When she asked you to name all 5 liberties in the First Amendment, if you couldn't, what does that mean? If you don't know what your rights are, how do you know they're not already gone? And if you don't know what your rights are, that tells me you're not exercising them daily, and they are already gone for you. Because your rights are a use or lose kind of thing. And if you're not using them, if you're not exercising your rights daily, you will never notice when they're gone until it's too late. We talk about constitutionally protected rights. Do you know that's impossible? The Constitution does not protect your rights. Can the Constitution pick up a pen and write your congressman a letter? Can the Constitution sit in your senator's office and demand compliance? Absolutely not. Thomas Jefferson said the tree of liberty must be fertilized by the blood of patriots and tyrants every 20 years. He was talking about the way of kingdoms, by the way, not republics. We should thank God we haven't repeated that history, but what if we have to? Can the Constitution pick up a sword for you? The only protection of your rights is sitting in your seat. And if you can't define your liberties, how are you going to defend them? That's why this is important. It's just as important, as Chalise said, eating breakfast. There should be 2 daily devotionals that every Christian has in their life. A devotion, the Word of God, every day. And a devotion with understanding your rights. Many times they're one and the same, right, Pastor? Clause 61 of the Magna Carta is where we establish the right of the people to petition the government for a redress of their grievances. We didn't invent it. We inherited it. Now, John is going to sign the Magna Carta with a sword at his throat. And the people are going to remove him from the throne less than 6 months later. But now we not only have a promise in writing from the king, we have a demand and a power in the people to keep that promise. But here's the thing in human nature. How many of you think that kings are going to like being told what to do by men? No, because we haven't changed the principle of divine right. They still think God's put them there. And they believe the only person that can tell them anything is God himself. And they're not really interested in what he has to say most of the time either. So in the next 400 years, the English people are going to be fighting with their kings and a queen or two to establish their liberties, maintain their liberties, and maintain their limited monarchy. We're going to fast forward to this king. His name is Charles I. He's a young, handsome king, and those who lived in his reign described him to be a bit of a party animal. You see, they said Charles loved to romp about Europe, spending on his every whim and fancy. Whose money is Charles spending? The people's. How is he collecting their money? Taxes. Now, I don't know if Charles played golf in 1625, but doesn't this piece of history prove that we've been paying for vacations for quite some time? Now, that royal council created in 1215 is now called Parliament. And Parliament gets sick and tired of Charles' wasteful spending. And they stand up to Charles and they say, hey, Charles, if you get your spending under control, we're not going to pass any more of your bills. Because you see, even in 1625, we have separation of powers. We have a legislative branch in Parliament, an executive branch in the King, and a judicial branch. And even back then, there were things that the executive could not do, reserved to the legislative branch. So in 1625, we have the legislative branch standing up to the executive branch and telling them, you're going to get a proper budget or we're going to defund you. Novel idea, right? Charles looks at Parliament and says, hey, I hear you, but let me ask you a question. God put me here. Who put you here? And he dissolves Parliament. Wow. Now, he didn't have to call in the sergeant at arms to remove them from the court, right? He could have just simply stood up and told the people, you know, in order to have a properly functioning government, we have to do this without all this opposition. And this Parliament is opposing the operation of government. So I want to make a promise to you. If Parliament will not pass laws, where they will not create laws, I'm just going to go ahead and regulate. Maybe he held a State of the Kingdom address and said, dear people of the kingdom, I make a promise to you that we will have what you need, we will perform the duties and the services that you need, we will continue to provide you with all your needs. And if Parliament will not help us, then we will do it without them. After all, I have a quill and a messenger. Isn't that the same as dissolving Parliament, declaring them to be powerless? And if they act like it, they are, aren't they? Well, Charles has a problem. Charles has learned from the last 400 years in history that if you get too tyrannical too fast, you start violating these written charters too quickly, the people are going to hold a sword at your throat. Now, he's just dissolved Parliament, so he's got to figure out a way to collect the people's money, because to pass a tax would be unconstitutional. You'd be guaranteed to have some problems. Now, remember, the king has a power to write law from the throne. It's called the power of decree. So Charles comes to the people and he says, I'm exercising my God-given power to issue a decree so that our government can maintain its functions. Because you realize we have to have money to maintain our functions, right? So I'm going to pass this decree to collect your money. But don't worry, I'm not violating your Constitution because it's not a tax. It can't be a tax, you see, because I'm calling it something else. He declares it to be a forced loan. Right? It's not a tax. You have to give me your money, but don't worry, I'm going to pay it back. You don't have a choice, you have to give it to me, but I'll pay you back. People are like, what? Are you kidding me? Tax? Mandate? We don't care what you call this. This is a violation of our Constitution, a violation of our liberty, and we're not going to comply. I have to wonder, though, would Charles have been a little bit more successful with his forced loan if he had a little bit of modern wisdom and instead had called it Social Security? Isn't that what Social Security is? A forced loan to the government? Oh, don't worry, we'll pay you back. How's that going to work out for us? 5 knights stand up to Charles and say, guess what? We took an oath to defend the liberty and the rights of the people. We took an oath to our charters. We're not going to collect your tax, no matter what you call it. We're not going to enforce your laws, and we're not going to pay them ourselves. That's, by the way, that, by the way, is why it is important for you to have a constitutional sheriff today. Because that is the authority that your constitutional sheriff has. That is the duty constitutional sheriff possesses to stand in defense of the oath that he took to defend the rights and the liberties of the people, regardless of what the government says. He is not an agent of the government, and since 1215, he has been a defender of the liberties of the people. Well, Charles arrests those 5 knights. He indefinitely detains them and denies them their right to a trial. A rebellion comes against Charles, which brings us the 3rd document in the history of our Constitution. This one is the Petition of Right of 1628. This one is a list of grievances according to Clause 61 of the Magna Carta on how Charles has violated the Magna Carta and the 1100 Charter of Liberties. It says there'll be no taxation without representation, regardless of what you call it. Due process is a right of the people, not something that the government can give and take away based on their conveniences. But while we've got the sword at the king's throat, we're going to secure more liberty for the people and limit the government even more. You see, you can't declare martial law on us unless we're actually at war being invaded by the enemy. And you cannot quarter soldiers in our homes. Does that sound familiar? Somebody tell me what amendment that is? The 3rd Amendment. We did not invent it. We inherited it from 1628. Now, Charles is going to sign the Petition of Right the same way John did, with a sword in his throat. But the people do not remove Charles from the throne like they did John. They let him remain king. Do you suppose they thought Charles had learned a lesson from the rebellion? What do you think? Well, Charles actually did learn a lesson, but not the one that the people wanted him to learn. See, Charles has learned that if I'm going to spend the people's money, I have to make an excuse to make them want to give it to me. And the years between 1628 and 1641 provide Charles with the perfect excuse. These are very violent times in Europe. Wars everywhere. And Charles is able to come to his own kingdom and say, hey, my dear kingdom, do you see all those wars our friends are fighting in their land? Let me ask you a very important question. Do you want those wars to come to our kingdom? Of course not. I have a perfect plan to keep those wars from coming to our kingdom. You see, all you have to do is give me your tax dollars, and I'll make sure that all our allies are adequately funded in their wars, and they'll be superior in power, they'll be superior in strength, which means they'll win those wars over there. And if they win those wars over there, what does that mean for us? We're safe. We're secure. And they won't come here. See, I told you it was the perfect plan. You really don't have to do much of anything. It's just a matter of national security that you pay your taxes. But the people are watching Charles very closely, because 1628 was a big year. And they're noticing Charles is lying to them. Charles is not funding their allies. He's funding their enemies. Because the enemies have made a deal with Charles that the allies wouldn't make. And the deal is, I help you win over there, you come over here and help me get my people back under subjection. Charles is brought up on charges of treason, found guilty, and sentenced to death. A process which brings us to our 4th document, called the Grand Remonstrance of 1641. It reads in the preamble, the root of all this mischief we find to be a malignant and pernicious design in subverting the fundamental laws and liberties of our kingdom. And we sort of of up-translate that to 21st century language, basically what they're saying is, we've been watching government now for about 600 years, and we're beginning to notice a pattern. The same bag of tricks, a wicked, evil plan whose only purpose is to overturn and undermine our liberty. This grand remonstrance is a list of grievances against Charles on how he's violated the Petition of Right, the Magna Carta, the 1100 Charter of Liberties. And when you read those grievances, which you can on your cell phone, you find that design. Everybody ready? See if it sounds familiar. Corruption of the court system. Infiltration of foreign law. The government diminishing the property rights of the people. The government inserting itself to manipulate and control the church. The government creating fiat money to manipulate the monetary system to control the people. And the government disarming the people while the government remained armed. Malignant and pernicious design. And those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat its mistakes. How many of you ever heard of Agenda 21? How many of you ever heard the term sustainable development? Would you be interested in knowing that the United Nations did not invent the principles of sustainable development? Go read the Grand Remonstrance, and you will find that Charles was engaging in sustainable development by plan and by decree. The grievances against Charles list that Charles was taking the land from the landowners in an effort of resource preservation, and I quote, depopulation. They also said that Charles was attempting to take them off the gold and silver standard by creating brass fiat money. And in 1648, they chopped off his head. Now, before you get too excited, moving forward in our history, we have a king named James II. And he's going to get into the same old design. But you see, James has learned from his history, although the people maybe not so much. He has learned that he can take from the people as he chooses, as long as he gives them something to distract them from what he's taking. And so James comes before the people, and he just declares himself to be this magnanimous king. And I'm going to give you something you've never had before. By decree, I am going to institute religious liberty. You see, my decree, the Declaration of Indulgence, will declare that you no longer have to be a member of the Church of England. You can have church anywhere you want, anytime you want, with any pastor you want, preach anything you want, and the government will not persecute you or prosecute you. On one condition. By decree, before you have your church, you must inform the king where you'll be meeting, when you'll be meeting, who will be preaching, what will be said, and you must promise that you will never, ever, ever say anything bad about the king in church. How many of you think that's religious liberty? How many of you think that sounds like a 501c3? Do you know there is very, very little difference between his decree and a 501c3? The 501c3 still makes you declare where you're preaching, what you're preaching, who you're preaching to, and you can never say anything bad about the government. So if our 501c3 is no different than James' decree, what's the difference between 1688 and 2017? Well, the difference is simple. In 1688, the bishops stood up to the king, and they said, guess what? We have a a promise over 500 years old that has declared that the church has no business, or the government has no business in our church. So we're going to preach whatever we want, and we're still not following your decree. James arrests 7 bishops. He throws them in prison and charges them with the crime of seditious libel. Now, seditious libel was that part of the decree that you can't talk bad about the king. Now, James has learned from his predecessors that if you deny the people their due process, they'll chop off your head. So James is going to make sure these 7 bishops get their day in court, but he has nothing to fear because the crime of seditious libel is written in such a way that truth is no defense. So when you're talking about the bad about the king, even if it's right, you still have to die. Here's the interesting thing about this history, however. These bishops got their day in court. 2 of them had their charges dropped because they had judges who refused to enforce an unconstitutional decree. The other 5 were found not guilty because they had a jury of their peers who refused to find them guilty of an unconstitutional law. You see, we did not invent our right to a trial by jury. And we did not invent the essential check and balance of liberty called jury nullification. We inherited them and lost them in the same proof. A rebellion forms against James called the Glorious Revolution of 1688. They call it the Glorious Revolution, they said, because hardly a shot was fired. James got so scared they were going to chop off his head like Charles that he got on a horse and fled the entire kingdom. He went to get some help from the Normans. But we get the 5th document in the history of our Constitution, the English Bill of Rights. Now, before I go, I want to give you a little bit of historical trivia. You can help me with this. Remember, the king has a power to issue decree. That is to write law from the throne. Anybody know the last year an English king ever produced a decree? (1688). It resulted in the Glorious Revolution of 1689. The English Bill of Rights reads, whereas the late King James II, by the assistance of evil judges, counselors, and ministers employed by him, did endeavor to subvert and extirpate the laws and liberties of our kingdom. Now, I don't know about you, but I had no idea what extirpate meant. So I looked it up. It means to completely destroy. So let me ask you, if you completely destroy something, is there anything left? No. They said what James was doing was completely destroying liberty. They made a whole list of things, and we're not going to go through the whole list, but I want to share one with you, because you see, today's class is about showing you that our Constitution is built on historical principles, axiomatic truths that have proven themselves for over a millennia. This class is not based on my opinion. It is not based on my interpretation. It is based on history. It is based on human nature. It is based on the truth that history always repeats, and our founders knew it. How many of you seen this history repeating already? Let me show you just one more. They said James was completely destroying liberty by writing law, overturning law, and setting aside law when that was a power reserved to Parliament alone. Remember, they had separation of powers. And they said when the executive branch is writing law, overturning law, and setting aside law, the only result will always be the complete destruction of liberty. How is it that a people of 1688, with no cell phones, no Google Oracle, ABC or Fox News knew that executive orders were the complete destruction of liberty. And today our Congress does nothing. The last decree ever written by a king in 1688. Our presidents for decades have been exercising more power than British kings have exercised since 1688. How do we even have the audacity to refer to ourselves today as the land of the free? You see, George III did not invent tyranny, and Thomas Jefferson did not invent liberty in the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is a legal document based on Clause 61 of the Magna Carta, which legally established the right of all British people to petition the government for a redress of their grievances, and that's what the Declaration of Independence is. A petition of grievances against George III on how he's violated the English Bill of Rights, the Grand Remonstrance, the Petition of Right, the Magna Carta, and the 1100 Charter of Liberties. These 5 documents made the British Constitution. And when you read those documents and then you read Jefferson's writing of the Declaration of Independence, you see that Jefferson didn't actually write that as much as he plagiarized it. He didn't have to rewrite it. It had been written for 700 years. Because you see, some truths are just self-evident. Some truths have proven themselves for over a millennia. That people possess rights by the nature of their creation. And that the only reason we institute government is to secure those rights. And in order for that, government must be limited in its power. And people must govern the government. The greatest gift our framers give us was not liberty. God gave us that. The greatest gift our framers gave us was the opportunity to self-govern. And the greatest condemnation on America today is our refusal to self-govern. It was liberty that they were searching for, to secure it for us. John Adams wrote in 1765, "Liberty must at all hazards be supported." Notice he didn't say health care. But he didn't say national security either. He said liberty. We have a right to it derived from our Maker. Because liberty is a gift from God, not from documents, not from government, and not from men. Liberty is a simple mathematical equation that I teach to my young people. Liberty equals freedom plus morality. You see, pure freedom is what we're born with. God created us. We are free to choose how we choose. We're free to do whatever we want, but we don't want to live in a society based on freedom. If we live in a society based on freedom, then I'm free to lie, I'm free to steal, and I'm free to murder. I am free to do whatever I want, regardless of how that hurts you. How many of you want to sign up for that piece of real estate? Liberty and freedom are not the same thing. Because you see, liberty is freedom plus morality, that shared understanding that I'm free to do whatever I want, but there are some things that I won't do because they are wrong. And our fathers have earned and bought it for us at the expense of their ease, their estates, their pleasure, and their blood. That is the price of liberty. And that's what they did for us. The Declaration of Independence, the signers of the Declaration of Independence, all pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. Not for themselves, but so that we could be free. So that our children could be free. Because liberty is not a gift that you secure for yourself. Liberty is a gift that you pay forward. Samuel Adams said, when we tamely suffer a lawless attack upon our liberty, we encourage it. And we involve others in our doom. He said it's a serious consideration that should weigh heavy upon our hearts, that ages and millions yet unborn will be the miserable sharers of our experience. That's what they did for us. Do we think in our intellectual advancement that we deserve more comfort than they sacrificed for us? Maybe we just deserve less sacrifice. Or maybe he deserves less liberty. Because that's what we're saying. When we become pacified in our prosperity, when we become lazy in our luxury, when we become complacent and compliant in our comforts, and we will not stand today, what we're declaring is that he deserves less liberty and he deserves to fight for it. We have to make that choice. Stop looking for a political messiah. Because no matter how you feel about the President of the United States, he can't fix what's wrong with Washington, D.C., and you don't want him to. For the President of the United States to fix what's wrong with Washington, D.C., you must first transmute him from a president into a king. And that's not who we are. It's a position, it's a choice that each and every individual must make. Each and every individual in this room must make. As you look at these young people, you go through your lives the rest of this week and you look at these young people in their faces, ask yourself, what have I done to defend their liberty today? Today. Because if you can't think of just one thing, then we're not doing what we need to do. Winston Churchill said, if you will not fight for the right when you can easily win without bloodshed, if you will not fight when the victory is sure and not too costly, you may have to fight when, with all the odds against you and only a precarious chance of survival. But he said there may even be a worse case. You may have to fight when there is no hope, because it's better to perish than to live as a slave. Is that the future we want for our children? Or do we want to be, as Thomas Paine declared, generous parents who will say, if there be trouble, let it be in my days so my child may have peace? Well, we're going to have to let go of some security. We're going to have to let go of some comfort. And we're going to have to get educated. Because that's the only way that we will have the courage to stand. How many of you know we're not teaching this in our schools? This history that I just taught to you is available for your young people in these three formats. The blue book, Bedtime Stories for Budding Patriots, is for non-readers. It's a read-to-me book. The purple book is for independent readers. Raise your hand if you can read. True. See, here's the thing. I have more adults that buy this book for themselves than they do for the young people in their lives, because did you learn this history? Let me ask you this question. If we've been teaching this history for the last, 60 years, how different would America look today? Think about the difference we can make in the future if we start teaching our children now. We also have this class in DVD format. It's less than an hour in length. It's much abridged for the younger people. We don't have this DVD with us, but you can get it online at the website. How many of you have figured out that the government's way out of control? Do you know everywhere I go, people tell me the same thing? What do you think the most asked question I get is?
What can we do?
How do we fix it? Do you know if we've been teaching the Constitution properly for the last 150 years, we'd know how to fix it? Well, it wouldn't even be a question, you're right. But we would know how to fix it even if there was, because you see the solutions to fixing our government problems are the same solutions that existed in 1789. They haven't changed. We have. That's why I wrote the book Sovereign Duty. Sovereign Duty is a book not based on my opinions, not based on my interpretations, but based on history, fact, and the advice and warnings and plan that the framers, our framers, put into place to take care of the government that we have today. Do you see the wisdom that they had? They knew this history. Would it surprise anybody to know they actually anticipated the federal government that we have today? Go read the ratification debates. You will see them say, if we do not do this, this is exactly what we'll have. We have become their warnings. Well, they also took the time to tell us how to fix it. And that's what sovereign duty does. And as Julie said, I don't want you to believe a single word that I've told you today. That's why in this book, not only do I give you their plan, I give you all my research. Every document, every quote in that book, I give you the original source text that it came from in the back of the book. All you have to do is follow a link and find it. Not only that, we can teach each other. We travel all over the country, we teach. We have my classes. I have over 10 classes that I teach now, and we're developing new ones every single day. Well, maybe not every day, but Janet's like, no, not every day. My husband here teaches a class that's essential for all Christians to understand that they have a biblical duty to defend liberty against tyrannical government. It's God's demand by God's reward. And all you have to do is contact us on the website, KrisAnneHall.com, here in front of it, and we will come and teach your classes for you. We have no speaking fees, and we won't make you pay us for our travel or our expenses. We operate by faith. And by faith, for 7 years, we have done nearly 265 classes in over 22 states every single year. I have a radio show. How many of you listen to my radio show? How many of you just found out I have a radio show? Okay? Well, you can access my radio show through the website, and you can access it if you have an iPhone or an Android. You can download my mobile app to your phone for free, and you can have my radio shows there. Not only that, my assistant Janet, who is with me today, if you have the mobile app, she will send you a message every time I'm going to be near you teaching. How many of you would like to come to another class? Get the mobile app and you'll never miss it. How many of you would like your legislators in Austin to know their primary duty to their oath to the Constitution? I teach that class. I have taught that class in 10 states so far in the last 2 years. And I can come teach it in yours too. Hey, let me tell you something. I taught that class to the legislators in Oregon. It doesn't matter, they're still accountable for what they learned. You see, I can teach them all day, but if the people won't make them do it, it doesn't mean anything. But I'm thinking, if I can teach that class in Oregon, why shouldn't I be able to teach that in the Republic of Texas? Right? Their duty to defend the Constitution of the United States is not what they think it is. Remember that pop quiz about the 5 liberties in the First Amendment? If you want to know how to exercise those 5 liberties daily, that's why I wrote this book. My husband calls this Constitutional Activism 101. Not only teaches you about those 5 liberties, but what you can do every single day to make sure you don't miss it when they're trying to take it away. I have a 3 DVD pick your hands up again. See all these people with their hands up? Go ask them about the 5-hour workshop. I'm confident in what they'll tell you.
Bring your lunch.
Bring lunch. No, sometimes they have food. Sometimes they have food. So, that 3 DVD set is my 5-hour workshop with bonus material. I not only cover the history that I just gave you today, but I walk through the Bill of Rights 1 through 10. I show you where they came from, what they mean, through history, through fact, how they're supposed to work, what we're doing wrong, and the things we need to do to make it right. Plus, I have a bonus section on the 17th Amendment, because that was just a huge kick in the pants. And we got to figure that one out so we can get rid of it. The DVD set and the Sovereign Duty we offer as a special offer together for a special deal of $40. You can get all 4 books and the DVD set outside for $70. And remember, it's mutually beneficial. You get the education, and we get to move on to the next meeting. That's how it works. We also have t-shirts where will be an icebreaker to make people talk about it. Janet, stand up. There's Janet. She has the black t-shirt, the Liberty First Brigade. My son also has the black t-shirt on. Sir, stand up here in the front. He is wearing the gray Liberty First Brigade t-shirts. We have them available. We have them available. The magical pistol? Oh, you do? Oh. Oh, no. Sorry, slow. We have women's cut t-shirts, men's sizes, and if we don't have your size, we can fix that for you too. All of these things are available as a tool. Because you see, my only prayer here today is that you leave different than you came. Because if we haven't changed something today, then I've just spoken to an empty room. And as the pastor said, it's not the numbers that matter. Because if we leave here unchanged, it doesn't matter if there's 80 or 8,000, the room was still empty. And the reason we do what we do is because that little boy outside there means more to me than life itself. And I don't want him to have to fight for a freedom I was supposed to give to him. And that's why we do what we do. Thank you for bringing me here today. Thank you for your hospitality, Pastor. Let me tell you what. You need to thank the pastor for opening the doors here, because there are churches in America that will not let me teach. Specifically me. I was contacted by a man who wanted me to teach to a group from the Daughters of the American Revolution, and the leader said that my classes were too political. I said she needs to learn a little bit about her ancestry. But there are churches that have deemed the Constitution and its history to be political, and they don't want to jeopardize their 501c3, and they don't want to make somebody mad in the pew, and they have banned me. Sent letters to their churches and said KrisAnne Hall is not to be in our churches. So, Pastor, thank you. I do not take you opening God's doors to us lightly. I want to thank Miss Finch for being here today, for being a living example, and for sharing her heart, and admitting it's not easy. I think sometimes when we look at the founders, we somehow think that they were superhuman and it was easy for them. It was not. I have a class called The Forgotten Founders that will prove to you just how difficult it was.
KrisAnne, will you take questions? And maybe 3, 4, 5.
Well, our time is up, but I can, if it's all right with everybody, I'll take, here's what we'll do. I will officially end. And if you have to go, step outside, talk to my husband, talk to my son. If you want to get some materials, you can get with them. Janet will be out there to help them as well. You can do that. If you want to stay and ask 4 questions, because that'll take me long enough. you have to ask a question, though. And I'm going to make you get to your question quickly. Now, I'm going to give the pastor the opportunity to ask the first one because he looks awfully eager.
Just explain to us what it looks like when Congress holds the courts accountable.
What does it look like when Congress holds the courts accountable? I want to sort of give you a visual reference, if you will. Pull out your pocket Constitution. Look at Article 1. It's like long. That's the description of the power delegated to Congress. Now look at Article 2. That's the description of the power delegated to the President. Now look at Article 3. The power delegated to the judiciary. There is a hierarchy in power in government. Congress holds the most power. Within Congress, the House holds more power than the Senate. They are not co-equal. And if we could grasp that little jewel, we could revolutionize and restore our constitutional republic. House holds more power than the Senate. Congress holds more power than the President holds more power than the judiciary. If we could overturn another brainwashed lie we've been taught, we could change America as well. Simple little things like, no, judges do not hold lifetime appointments. A lifetime appointment is a king. Judges hold their appointments on good behavior. Do you know what that means? We are supposed to be watching over our judges like we watch over a classroom of kindergartners to make sure that they're behaving well. And when they refuse to behave well, like determining that the Constitution is not relevant in their courtroom, like Judge Anna Brown, or like Justice Thomas J. Thomas Martin in Kansas federal court that declared Kansas law is irrelevant in his courtroom because he's a federal courtroom. And he decided that he could choose the defense that available to the defendants. They were not allowed to choose their own defense. Bad behavior. How about the judge in Nevada right now? I can't remember her name. I think it's, what is it? Navarro. Before the trial started, she read my name out to the entire courtroom and asked any of the jurors if they knew me. If you know KrisAnne Hall, you will be immediately dismissed from this courtroom. I am not on a witness list. Bad behavior. Article 4, Section 2 declares they are to be impeached and removed from office immediately.
What is that process?
The process is the House of Representatives draws up articles of impeachment and impeaches them.
Good luck with that. The Judiciary Committee has responsibility for oversight, and they are the ones to report back the bad behavior.
Yeah, they are to be a watchdog, but they are not the ultimate decision makers. You see, each and every representative in the House of Representatives has equal suffrage, which means equal representation. You see, we've corrupted Congress through the House of Representatives with these inventions of freshman senators and senior representatives. This classification of freshman and senior is completely tyrannical. It creates an aristocracy. It does not create a representative. Not only that, this idea of committees can only bring bills, and that some committees have more power than others, and that certain people in some committees have more power than others in that same committee. Do you know the Speaker of the House holds 5 votes in one committee? How is that possible? That means whoever is represented by the Speaker of the House gets 5 times the representation of everybody else. And that's not constitutional. That's their little political games that they've created. Now, if you are sort of shaking your your head at the whole impeachment thing, you're not alone. Jefferson thought impeachment of justices was worthless as well. He called it a scarecrow because he knew that the people in power would never impeach the justices who support and expand their power. That's why the solution to all this problem does not rest in Washington, D.C. The solution to all this problem, as my book Sovereign Duty points out, rests in the states. You see, these justices engaging in bad behavior, their decisions, their opinions should be completely ignored by the people in their states. You have no legal obligation to take any opinion of any court that is contrary to the Constitution. It is not law. It is not even lawful. And you have a right and a duty to look at that court and say, you know what, you've got your opinion, but it's wrong, and we're going to do what we need to do anyway. You have no obligation. And that's what I teach in the state sovereignty class, which takes about 90 minutes, so we won't be doing that here. Yes, sir.
In Austin testifying on the constitutional carry bill yesterday, and someone brought up something. This is pretty much what I've been studying, and I know my rights to the Second Amendment and all that. This old guy was in there testifying as well. He said that the state of Texas can violate that Second Amendment because this doesn't stand. Texas can.
Okay, does the Second Amendment apply to states? No. Here's the problem. That's the simple answer. Okay? The real answer is understanding why the Second Amendment is there. Right? We've been brainwashed for many, many years to believe that the Bill of Rights was incorporated into the Constitution to limit the government. It is not. I teach a class on this. It's called The Great Debate. The purpose of the Bill of Rights was not to limit government. We didn't need to limit government. It was already limited. If it's not delegated, they can't do it. We didn't have to tell them what they could not do. We already told them the only things they could do. The purpose of the Bill of Rights, in a nutshell, was to remind the people of their natural rights so they would not allow government to transgress their natural rights. Samuel Adams wrote a document called The Natural Rights of the Colonists in 1772. He said, among the natural rights of the colonists are these: first, life; second, liberty; third, property; together, number 4, with the right to protect and defend them in the best means possible. Your right to keep and bear arms is essential to the first law of nature, the right to self-preservation. It is a natural right. Your right to keep and bear arms does not come from the Second Amendment. It is not a Second Amendment right. It is a natural right. And the only reason you created the state of Texas, go read the Declaration of Independence, the only reason you created the state of Texas was to secure your natural rights. And remember, the Declaration of Independence says that when any form of government becomes destructive of these means, our natural rights, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. So it is irrelevant what the Second Amendment says to your state, because your state has a duty and obligation to secure your natural rights, and in those natural rights is your natural right to self-preservation, which is your right to keep and bear arms. You don't keep and bear arms so you can hunt and skeet shoot. You keep and bear arms so that you can secure your life, your liberty, and your property, and so that you can overthrow governments. That means you have to be able to even overthrow your state government if necessary. And so they cannot be infringing on your natural right, because then you're a slave. So if you don't have the right to protect and defend your life, your liberty, your property, then what you have is a privilege to do so. And if your life, your liberty, and your property is a privilege by request, then you are a slave. Two more, yes, sir.
The Convention of States, your opinion and ratification of the 16th Amendment.
Okay, I'm only going going to do the first one because you're only allowed one question. And my opinion on the Convention of States is irrelevant. Just like my opinion on everything else. Which is why I don't teach my opinions. But Convention of State is a complicated thing. And we're not talking about, it's difficult to talk about. When I talk about an Article 5 convention because that is the only way you can amend the Constitution is through Article 5. And if we're going to amend the Constitution, there are certain things we must educate ourselves on before we call a convention. And I have a whole chapter in my book, Sovereign Duty, about that will help you understand that. It's also a whole nother class. Yes, ma'am. Final question.
Okay. I've never seen any teaching materials on the 7th Amendment and the 9th Amendment. And I always love these severability clauses in municipal government.
Okay, well, the 7th Amendment has to do with due process in civil cases, meaning your property, okay? They cannot deny you of due process with anything, the government bringing case against you, anything over $20, okay? So that has to do with due process. That has to do with your right to your property and keep government from taking it with arbitrarily, by force, or without due process. The 9th Amendment is the most important clause in the entire Constitution and the Bill of Rights. I teach a class on that. It's called it's part of that understanding why we have the Bill of Rights class, the Great Debate. The 9th Amendment is what makes us a republic and not a kingdom. It is the 9th Amendment that declares all the rights in the universe belong to the people. They are not gifts from government. They are possessions of men. The 9th and 10th Amendment work together in a contract formed called the Rules of Construction. The 9th Amendment is Rule of Construction number 1. The 10th Amendment is Rule of Construction number 2. In a contract, rules of construction are always in the contract to tell the one applying the contract the rules on applying the contract. Every contract has rules of construction. Rule of construction number 1 in the 9th Amendment, all the rights in the universe belong to the people. So no matter what section, what clause you're applying in the Constitution, that first, in any application of that section, you must first understand the proper way to apply that is considering that all the rights belong to the people. Rule of construction number 2, power is delegated to government. Delegated, not surrendered. So whenever you're applying any term of the Constitution, you must first remember that any application of the Constitution must reflect that all the rights belong to the people and only certain powers are delegated to government.
Thank you.
Now if you give me just 2 seconds to go back and talk about this thing, because it really is complicated and deserves more time. Does the Second Amendment apply to the states? Okay? So if you just stand up and say no, like that gentleman did, you miss the bigger picture on why your right to keep and bear arms applies to the states. So we've got to change the way we talk about things. It's not a Second Amendment right. It doesn't come from the Second Amendment. But yet when we look at our governments and say, you can't violate my Second Amendment, what in the world is that? We need to change it and say, you were instituted to secure my rights, and you cannot violate my natural right to self-preservation. And that's the best I can do in this time. Thank you, Pastor.
Thank you, present you with a special gift for your labor of love and your participation in informing us about our rights and the privileges we have in our Constitution. Look, folks, let's say a word of prayer before we leave. There's a basket in the back. Would you please drop something in and help support our effort to make this available to you here in the church? Let's pray. Stand on your feet. Let's pray. Just take a moment, pull your money out of your pocket. Okay. Come on. Father, we thank you so much for KrisAnne and what she has challenged us with tonight. And for her, Father, being available to you to
writing and in book form and DVD, The Essence of Our Liberties. I love what Thomas Paine had to say. Father, let the suffering be mine, so it not be on my children. I love that. And I pray that we would take that to heart as we leave this place, that we're fighting for our children. In Jesus' name, amen.